So the Bolton media meltdown, this is something that we kind of rushed through last week, and I wanted to sort of take this a step by step and not try to cram so much information to just sort of make a few points now. So last week we tried to talk about like 4 or 5 different news sources, and I wanted to talk about just the Federalist, which is a publication that really has been struggling the past couple of years. The quality has gone down precipitously. So specifically, what we're looking at is, well, let's start here. This is about Michael Flynn. It's not about John Bolton, although we're going to get there. That there is a little quote here where he says, Comey added that he had no indication thus far that Flynn had passed classified information to Kislyak, but he noted that the level of communication is unusual. The email did not explain how it would be, quote, unusual, unquote, for an incoming national security advisor to converse with the foreign leaders ahead of a new president's inauguration. Did you catch what he did there?
Not exactly. Could you repeat it?
Yeah. Comey added that he has no indication thus far that Flynn had passed classified information to Kislyak, who is the Russian, I guess, ambassador. But he noted that the, quote, level of communication is unusual. The email did not explain how it would be unusual for an incoming national security advisor to converse with foreign leaders of a new president's inauguration. So there's a little bait and switch in those two sentences.
I see it now.
Yeah. He said, Comey says that the level of communication is unusual, and Sean Davis implies essentially that it's not unusual for the national security advisor to converse with foreign leaders, which, that's look, what Comey is saying is arguable. Okay. I'm not saying that Comey is right, but Sean Davis is simply not addressing what is being said. Now, the reason why this came to my attention was because this was something that got published on MSN. So it was not just on the Federalist website, which is, it's basically an opinion site. They build themselves as being a place for think pieces. So this is kind of a long article, and it's more kind of newsy than most of their things, which is, it doesn't take necessarily a hard position, but you can see there's a bit of commentary here right in the middle where there's kind of a little bit of a bait and switch. And when, CNN or MSNBC do this kind of thing, the Federalist especially is like the first organization to jump all over them and say, hey, you're editorializing in the middle of your news story. And, here the Federalist has their first news story, perhaps ever. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they don't do a whole lot of news stories. And, they just punted. They just blew it. And they committed the exact same sin that they so frequently accuse CNN of. So I just want to keep that in mind, because there's 2 more things in the Federalist that I wanted to point out, because Bolton has been in the news, and there he is. There's the man himself, the guy with the walrus mustache. So here's an article by Jonathan Tobin. I can't say I'm all that familiar with Tobin. He's not a main contributor to the Federalist, but you can see what the headline is: Foreign policy elites want to dump John Bolton, but Trump shouldn't fall for it. And what they're saying is, in so many words, that Bolton is a hawk, that he's America first. He's tough on Iran and so on and so forth, and he's the guy that Trump should stick with. But and they don't use the phrase "the deep state" in this article, but that's sort of the implication, that the Washington policy elite don't want John Bolton. The deep state is after John Bolton. And it says right there, in other words, National Security Advisor John Bolton is a dead man walking, even if he doesn't know it yet, which actually is going to be echoed in our next segment here. Kind of interesting. Now, so here, John Bolton is the scrappy outsider telling truths that nobody wants to hear. Oh,
I'm
boy.
Sorry, that's laughable. John Bolton's an outsider.
Oh, did you read the next piece already? Are you ahead of me?
No, I'm just saying that just my reaction to that. I can't let that just slide. I mean, the idea that John Bolton is an outsider.
Yeah.
That he's some sort of crazy maverick in the neocon community. I mean, if you want to argue neocons are outliners, I would, because I don't think the majority of conservatives are neocons. I really
Well,
don't. But
he's definitely a hawk. Yeah. Sorry, what was your point?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I guess you could argue that neocons don't represent most conservatives. At least I hope they don't. You know what I mean? Yeah. If you want to use that argument. But the idea that he's not an insider, I mean, this is a man who was the ambassador to the UN. Of course he's an insider.
Right. Well, if you could cue up the next piece here so we can look at the next headline. This is from 2020, just a year later. In fact, I think it's less than a year later. John Bolton is the perfect Washington man. Bolton is a thin-skinned and snarky figure who succeeded in convincing a surprising number of smart people in Washington that he is somehow serious and statesmanlike. Yes, including your columnists, the people who are they're not columnists, but they're your writers. You said this. You said this. You were the ones who were bamboozled, and now they're just backpedaling because they're pushing an agenda. No, here's the point I really wanted to make on this. They're bad at journalism. Okay, that story, even I know that they're trying to break stuff, but that was a really sleazy story on Flynn. Just the way that they presented it, like it just showed a lack of journalistic ethics. The whole bait and switch thing. They can't keep from adding commentary. Now, I don't have any problem with them saying this is our opinion. This is an opinion site, but for them to pass that off as journalism is lousy. But the other thing is, in their opinion pieces, let's face it, Tobin was pretending to have knowledge that he did not, in fact, have. And so when you read these opinion pieces, whether it's left, right, center, hawk, dove, neocon, libertarian, whatever the dichotomy is that you want to draw, a lot of these people are just making it up. And if the situation changes, if the names change, then their opinions change. The Federalist and the Federalist, it's hilarious that they attacked Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, who I'm not a big Jen Rubin fan. I don't know if you know her. She is, really, how do you even describe her? I mean, she's hawkish and she's kind of mean, and she doesn't seem to contribute a lot to the conversation beyond that. But they called her, they attacked her, and we mentioned this on the Twitter feed. They attacked her for flip-flopping on Bolton, and you could not have a bigger flip-flop on Bolton than this, that he went from being the brave truth teller to being the perfect Washington man, the guy who says exactly, just tells it like it is, to the guy who just wants to get invited to cocktail parties. They do have to make up their minds, I think, about what position they want to take. But you know what? I think we know exactly what position they want to take, which is whatever benefits Donald Trump. They have no integrity. They will turn on a dime depending on whether they like the person they're commenting on. And this is not analysis. This is hackery. This is starting with conclusions and then working your way backwards. Just intellectually dishonest.
Well, it's politics, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's politics.
Goodness.
This is what happens. So much of politics, let's face it, even when it comes to people, that are journalists, doing editorials, academia, a lot of it comes down to whether you like the person or not. That's really what it comes down to. And so people will be like, well, I like Trump. Mm-hmm. So therefore, no matter how ideologically inconsistent his actions are with your own personal beliefs, or at least your beliefs as they used to be, they suddenly change because you like the guy.
Right.
And you see this in micro and you see this in macro. You see it with individuals and you see it with publications, with political movements, with all of that. And it's very disingenuous, and if there's anything that, I would want to advocate, with our platform, it's that, you got to try to be at least a little bit ideologically consistent. When we talked about John Bolton last week, that's why I brought up Rand Paul's article, because Rand Paul was critical of John Bolton from the beginning. John Bolton apparently blames Rand Paul for not becoming Secretary of State. I know you've just started reading his book, Pete. Have you gotten to that part yet? Where
yes, I have. There are a number of quotes. I don't think I have that particular one highlighted. Let me bring up the right one here. So it's gosh, I have so there's so many little neat little tidbits just sprinkled throughout the book. It is a little hard to know where to start because
but to bring this,
with that,
Pete, but to bring this back, I just want to make this point. Rand Paul has been a great ally of Donald Trump and has consistently supported Donald Trump, even when he specifically will come up with issues and say, well, I don't agree with you here. I don't agree with you there. John Bolton, he always said was a bad idea. He always said that from day one. And he has remained an ally of the president. So you don't have to sell your soul just because you want to support a candidate or support a politician, support a government official. You don't have to sell your soul to do it. And I would use, again, Rand Paul as an example of that, particularly regarding John Bolton.
Yeah, well, I'd say that's certainly true. Well, we'll get to Rand Paul in a little bit, but I want to tie this back into Michael Flynn. This is something I think we all kind of knew about Michael Flynn, that he had lied to the FBI for no particular reason. And that's one of the reasons why, he's now been basically exonerated because the lie wasn't material. They were setting him up. But what's really interesting is what John Bolton says. Now, if you read the book, it's apparent that John Bolton started writing this while he was in the White House. And he probably didn't have a thesis in mind because it's kind of a breezy read. I mean, a lot of people have complained about the prose being hard to read. I think it's kind of a breezy personal style, to be honest. Some of the points in the book I would have preferred that he gave more detail. But here are the quotes. This is why Flynn would lie about an innocent conversation I never understood. And I think that's the question that a lot of people had. Why did Michael Flynn lie? And I think he kind of just got spooked, so to speak, by the FBI. But here's what I found even more interesting, because we already knew that part. So Trump himself told me a few days later. What Trump told me a few days later made more sense, namely that they had already lost confidence in Flynn for his inadequate performance, much as Kissinger had predicted. And the Russian issue was simply a politically convenient cover story. So if you remember, when Donald Trump threw Flynn under the bus, it was kind of a surprise. I don't know if you were surprised. I felt pretty surprised that happened. I thought that Trump would stick by him simply because he was his guy. But if he felt that there were deeper problems with Flynn, it sounds like the president made the decision to cut bait for other reasons, and then just use this as a pretext, which makes a lot more sense. I think it sort of
that makes a ton more sense. That makes a ton more sense. If he already had issues with him, performance issues, style issues, whatever they were. But if he already had issues with him, then it makes a lot more sense why he didn't defend him. Absolutely.
Right. And you had this sort of BS trumped up charge against him. Why not? I mean, you have a lot of resources in the executive branch. Just, bark a little louder and see if they scram. Okay, so let's bring up another quote, because there's a lot of little tidbits here. So one of the big things is that I thought was really valid that he brought up. Then explain why it's so inequitable that no nations other than Russia and America, such as China, Iran, North Korea, were limited in developing intermediate range capabilities, and that the Russians were violating the treaty. And I believe this is John Kelly pointing this out at this point, and Bolton is agreeing with them. And the idea is, I think it makes a lot of sense. If we have these treaties with other countries and we're the only ones abiding by them, why on earth would we continue to abide by them? What are we getting out of that besides maybe some ill-defined sense of I don't know, not even superiority, just an ill-defined sense of, well, we did the right thing even though they did the wrong thing. But it's not. These agreements are not in America's national security interest, and that's why I would push back against classifying him as a neocon, because neocons tend to be more internationalist, and Biden, or not Biden, Bolton is definitely more of the hawkish America first crowd.
Well, you remember the argument that I told you off the air that I have regarding that, which is that there's two kinds of globalists, in my opinion. In my opinion, is what, for lack of a better term, I'll call them the Marxist globalists. The Marxist globalists are completely international in nature, in that they are willing to undermine any single country, including the United States, in order to achieve their globalist ambitions. There is another kind of globalists. I would call this is sort of the New World Order globalists. This is that's the old quote from George W. Bush, or I'm sorry, not George W. Bush, but George Bush Sr.
H.W. Bush,
yeah, H.W. Bush. So he talked about the New World Order, and the New World Order to me is the idea of sort of a quasi-American imperialism, where we're the only reigning superpower, and therefore we sort of have an obligation to police the world. We have an obligation to basically be the enforcement arm of the globalist government. And therefore, it's an America First policy, but it's basically an America that's on the top of this globalist pyramid. That's what I believe. I think that there are two different camps when it comes to globalism.
I definitely think there's a big difference between, say, John Bolton and John McCain. There's a distinction to be drawn there. If you could kind of cue up the next thing, I'd appreciate it. Because he talks a lot about Iran in the book. And I thought these were there's a lot of interesting quotes about Iran. I couldn't include everything. But he's very hard on the Iranian nuclear deal. Here it says it purportedly resolved the threat posed by Iran's nuclear weapons program, but did no such thing. Which I think is right. Everything I've heard is, again, it gets back to, we have these agreements, and are the other parties living up to it? And if they're not, then, why are we bothering to live up to these agreements that the other party is not? But what I thought was interesting, and he didn't elaborate on this. He just sort of, it's an offhand comment, and I can sort of see what he's saying a little bit, but why doesn't he justify it? Why doesn't he give an example or two? Because he talks about Iran's continuing role as the world's central banker for international terrorism. Now, I think what he's saying is, you have Iranian-backed terrorists in Syria, in Lebanon. There have even been Iranian terrorists backed terrorists who have attacked a Jewish center in Argentina. So, they've sponsored acts of terror around the world. But to call them the world's central banker, I thought, it's kind of an interesting analogy, but I wonder what he really means by that. And unfortunately, he never really justified it. He just sort of threw it out there like, well, everybody knows. Well, everybody doesn't know. That's why you wrote the book, buddy. Well,
I guess that begs the question: who is he really writing the book to? Is he trying to justify himself amongst his elitist friends, or is he really trying to give the general population a greater insight into these decisions and justifications for these decisions, or not? Or is it all just a wink, wink, nod, nod?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that he knew exactly who his audience was going into writing this book, and I think that's the problem. That I said, a lot of people have complained about the style of writing. I don't think the style of writing is bad. It's an easy breezy beach read kind of thing in many ways. Obviously the subject matter is pretty serious, but it's not like he's using a lot of big words. He's not using a lot of convoluted sentences. The way the style, if you're just looking at style, I think the style is perfectly fine and perfectly readable. I think the real problem is, who is he writing this for? What is his goal? Like, what does he want people to know? Because little things like, where he uses that analogy of the central bank, but then he doesn't explain it, and that sort of problem pops up quite a bit throughout the book. But okay, let's kind of move on. There's a few more quotes on Iran, so let's cue that up. I thought this was interesting. So Trump then raised the topic of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, asking if he could designate it as a foreign terrorist organization, thereby subjecting it to additional penalties and constraints. Now, I don't know if you have any opinions on that designation. I'm guessing you might.
I don't know. It seems like a no-brainer to me that you would designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, they are.
So, is the issue because they're an official organ of a nation state? Is that what the problem is?
Oh no! Bolton was supportive of that move. He was supportive of that move. Other people in the cabinet were not. So I think he's trying to sort of bring the reader on side a little bit and say, "Hey, look at these good things that I encourage President Trump to do." Because obviously, if you are on the president's side, well, I'm not sure that he has a lot of strategy, but I think that might have been kind of the strategy there, was to point to the good America First things that he encouraged the president to do. All right, so let's move on to the next thing, which is Israel Palestine. And I thought this is where it gets really brutal. Everybody's talking about how he's taking swings at Trump. No, he takes swings at everybody in the cabinet who's not named John Bolton. So, oh my gosh. So Jared Kushner has taken a big role in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and so the Israeli Prime Minister was dubious about assigning the task of bringing an end to the Israel-Palestinian conflict to Kushner, whose family Netanyahu had known for many years. He wondered why Kushner thought he would succeed with the likes of Kissinger failed. Now, is that a zinger or what? I mean, oh my gosh, that is just from the top rope. Oh my gosh. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it seems to me that is a pretty hard hit on Jared. That he's this kind of dilettante who is trying to inject himself into one of the historically most intractable conflicts in the world, has no idea what he's doing, and he just doesn't have experience. And that's I think kind of John. If there are some themes here, that's one of John Bolton's big themes, is that some of the people around the president didn't have experience. He didn't think a lot of Steve Mnuchin, who was in on some of these discussions. He certainly didn't think a lot of Nikki Haley. He says at one point that she was just made the UN ambassador so that she could, check a box in preparation for running for president, get a little bit of foreign policy experience. And that way, when they ask her in 2024, why do you want to run for president? Well, I was the UN ambassador, so I know all about U.S. foreign policy. But in general, Bolton does not like Nikki Haley at all. Let's see here. I think we can probably skip that one. I mean, he talks about how Trump wanted him in the White House so that he could do a lot of interviews. That's kind of interesting. Trump told him that he has a lot of great support from those Freedom Caucus guys. Kind of interesting, especially given that Justin Amash and Thomas Massey are not his biggest fans. He says that he was in favor of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which that's their capital. I don't think at the time it seemed like a really big deal. People acted like this was a really controversial decision, but I think in retrospect we recognize that it was a big nothing. So again, he's sort of I think trying to let the reader know, look, hey, I made these common sense decisions that nobody else had the guts to make. Here's something though I thought was a little more interesting, which was that if you could cue up the next quotation here, it says, although there had been no clear offer and acceptance, both Kelly and I knew what had happened in the Trumpian way. And he's talking about how he shook hands in order to become the national security advisor. Now, leading up to this, what had happened was Bolton had the president had asked him, would you like to be the deputy secretary of state? And Bolton said, no, I don't want to be the deputy anything because, I've been in Washington for a long time and It'll be the person who is the Secretary of State, who at the time was Rex Tillerson, will think that I'm gunning for his job, and I probably will be. So it wouldn't be good for the country to have two people kind of fighting over the top spot. You need to have a chain of command, and if you want me there, you have to get rid of Tillerson essentially, and ultimately, when Flynn was out of the way, that made way for Bolton. So. But I thought that was interesting that this momentous decision was made over a handshake, rather kind of informal, kind of the way you expect, I think, Trump to make decisions like that.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest. So
no, I'm not surprised, and that's the one of the biggest takeaways is how little of this is surprising. He certainly doesn't like Rex Tillerson. If you could cue that up, yeah, thank you. He doesn't call him names, but here he's quoting Trump, trash talking Rex Tillerson, and Tillerson was arguing for $200 million for Syrian reconstruction. That's a lot of Republicans, including a lot of Republicans have argued that nation building is bad. What Bolton is arguing here and what Tillerson was arguing was essentially that this would support America's national security interests in a way that is less expensive than military conflict. I think this is where I say we talk about how we have these dichotomies: hawk versus dove, neocon versus non-interventionist. A lot of these things are more a matter of degree than kind, and we don't always appreciate it. Because if you do have a choice between spending money and deploying troops, and sacrificing American lives, you have to make that trade-off.
I think the problem is it very often doesn't work out that way.
Yeah.
I mean, there's example after example of nations that we've given money to. Right. Only to have it basically literally thrown back in our face. There's been some terrible policy decisions in regards to giving money to countries. I mean, the intentions are there, right? But right. The path to hell is paved with good intentions. So
and that's not an argument.
In principle, if you can do it, and in principle, if you can do it, but for instance, there's it was widely reported that for years and years, the reason that the United States avoided foreign terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, was because the CIA was paying terrorist organizations basically extortion money. Have you ever heard that?
No, I don't think I heard that.
That's an allegation. I can't remember the film, which is based on a book, so I assume it's in the book as well. It's about the Mossad operation to kill all of the terrorists involved in the Munich massacre when they killed the Israeli athletes. I'm sure you're familiar with the movie. Eric Bana is in it. It's a great movie. That's one of their main allegations, is that basically the United States government through the CIA was actually paying foreign terrorist organizations extortion money so that they wouldn't attack the United States. So if it's true, it was effective for quite a period of time, but I have a real big problem with it. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of murkiness you get into when you do stuff like that. Like you said, there are degrees, right? There are degrees. It's not just kind of one or the other. The principle sounds great. The principle of paying, buying bridges instead of bombs. I mean, that's a great slogan. Just doesn't always work out that way.
Right. So So to sort of tie this up, because that's a really important point I think that you just made. You have to ask, first of all, is there in fact an American national security interest at stake? And if there isn't, then there's nothing to discuss. We don't need to send troops. We don't need to send bridges or money to build bridges. But if we do that, it's not simply a matter of sending money and hoping that the person on the other end feels a sense of reciprocity, because once they have your money, well, they don't need you anymore. So these agreements need to be contingent on results. and too often we have sent foreign aid that has not been. I mean, Pakistan's kind of the classic example where we've sent them so much money over the years, and then they were cutting back deals with the Taliban. So what side are they on? Well, they're playing both sides, and you can't allow that. If you're going to send money to a foreign power, you have to hold them accountable, and we weren't doing that. So, all right, so I'll try to speed this up a little bit because there's so much here, and the book club will continue in subsequent weeks. But
you're only getting started, right? You're not even halfway through the book yet, are you, Pete?
I'm only 75 pages through, and there's a lot of interesting things here. And like I said, I mean, like, think about the things that we've talked about so far. Does this advance like a narrative of Trump being an idiot or Trump being a bad guy? I mean, not really. I mean, that's not my takeaway. I mean, certainly there are things in the book that are not flattering of the president. But honestly, this is kind of a meandering, not quite a travel log, but like a journal, almost a diary that John Bolton kept, because like he talks about details like this happened at 4 p.m. and this person said this at the meeting, this person said that, and this person pounded the table, and like that's a lot of detail. He did not just remember all of this after he left office. He was keeping notes the entire time, and he was famous for doing that, for filling up yellow notepads of everything that happened that he observed within the administration. So. If you could, if you could move on to the next quote, because kind of gets to Syria's dictatorship obviously had not learned its lesson. Deterrence had failed, and the issue now was how to respond appropriately. And I have a few more quotes in that vein. That military force is justified because of Assad was using chemical chemical weapons. He quotes the Sedwill, who is his British counterpart, says essentially that he shared his view. So, bolstering, saying, "Hey, I'm not the only person who thought this. This was kind of the consensus among the smart, serious people." But here's what I thought was a really interesting quote. Let me see if I can bring this next one up here. That I thought here's just another example of where I felt hey, you're writing a very long book. You could add a page or two and maybe these were things that were taken out because they were classified. Now that I think about it, but it would have been a lot more satisfying read if they had included the evidence for the next claim here. Which if you could, proof of the Assad regime's chemical weapons usage was increasingly clear in public reporting. So he doesn't refer to his own intel, which I thought was interesting. Public reporting, huh? Although left-wing commentators and even some on Fox were saying there was no evidence. They were wrong. So I mean, this is a big claim if it's true. And he he has a little citation there, but honestly, I mean, how serious are you going to take something that's public reporting as opposed to intelligence? I mean, what's really the source? Because then they just name unnamed sources, and you're just going down the rabbit hole.
That's not helpful. It's just not helpful in determining whether Assad actually used chemical weapons or not.
Right, and the name of the book is "The Room Where It Happened." Well, if you're in the room, why don't you tell us what happened instead of telling us what the the New York Times reported?
Why couldn't he say that, military intelligence sources confirmed that he had deployed chemical weapons? Why isn't that in there?
I don't know. I found it a very frustrating aspect of the book. I agree with you.
If he says that the proof is there, then why can't he just say, well, we got the proof from military intelligence? He can leave it at that. He doesn't say how. That doesn't give you anything, the means of operation. It doesn't expose operators. He can just say that it was a consensus among the military intelligence community. He doesn't say that. Mm-mm. That's telling to me, you know what I mean, as far as, okay, so where did that evidence come from?
Right. Yeah.
Besides open sources, which, as we know, open sources are neither here nor there.
So what we do know from the book is he didn't like Iran, and he didn't like Syria, and he really didn't like James Mattis. Uh, James Mattis has been in the news lately, but he says, I don't remember which page this was on. It says Mattis was our biggest problem, and the picture he's painted was our biggest problem. Really, in the White House, he's the biggest, but okay, maybe a little bit. I think he was frustrated when he wrote that, but and in that situation, maybe that's factually correct. But you see the quote at the bottom says Mattis knew where he wanted Trump to come out militarily, which is kind of hilarious because that's the job of everybody who's advising the president. They know where they want the president to come out militarily. Now, what Bolton would say, and what Bolton does say throughout the book, is essentially that your job as an advisor is to give the president a menu of options and not to steer him one way or the other. Just let him choose, the path he wants to take. I think that's a bit disingenuous. I don't think John Bolton would have accepted a position in the White House as the national security advisor unless he had some pretty strong ideas about the course of action that he wanted the president to take. But over and over again, he accuses James Mattis of essentially deck stacking. And again, maybe this is a matter of degree or style or exactly how he did it. I think all advisors do it. But if I'm trying to be really generous to Bolton here, I think what he's saying is that Mattis did this, to an unacceptable degree or in an unacceptable way, by not providing the president with an understandable menu of options, and the way that Bolton phrased it was like low, medium, high, and that Mattis, it was all kind of apples and oranges, and how do you really compare one option to the next? Oh, they all seem so similar, but they're a little bit different, and and he felt that was manipulative the way that he did that.
I'd agree. If that's true, I agree with that. But I also agree with you that I very much doubt that Bolton didn't have an agenda. I do think that in those positions, you're supposed to give options to the president. Right. Another good movie, I remember the one about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's pretty good. I forgot what it's called. It's the one with Kevin Costner, where he plays the chief of staff. And there's the Adlai Stevenson moment. No. Is it Adlai Stevenson? He was the UN ambassador, right, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
That could be right. Yeah, because,
He was a loser in numerous presidential campaigns.
Right.
But he was the UN ambassador. And if I said the wrong name, I apologize. But he was the UN ambassador at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. And in the movie, it depicts that he's the one who first suggested concession, that he basically was the first one that presented that option on the table. And he has this moment where he says, have you ever seen someone, I guess this is the first time you saw someone slit their own throat, because he was the only person in the room saying that. And the thing that which by the way, they basically did what he said. They ended up taking the missiles out of Turkey in order for the Russians to, the Soviet Union to save face, taking the missiles out of Cuba. That's ultimately what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But at first, it just took the air out of the room. It just took the air out of the room. So the thing there is that he still was presenting the option. It was a very unpopular option. He may or may not have agreed with the option himself. But that's what I remember kind of saying in the movie was, somebody had to say it. Somebody had to put it out there. And the irony is that's ultimately what they did. Ultimately, they took the missiles out of Turkey so that the Russians would take their missiles out of Cuba. But that was after they realized that the missiles in Turkey were obsolete. so they weren't really giving the Soviets anything other than allowing them to save face. At first, they thought they were betraying an ally, which, by the way, that's a lot of what was been happening now with Mattis. Mattis, one of his biggest concerns was us betraying the Kurds. That's why he became so upset. Because he didn't see the Kurds slaughtered. But again, I'm just saying that I agree with the principle that as in these positions, it is your obligation to present multiple options to the president and present them in a way that you're saying, hey, A, B, or C, you make the decision, as opposed to stacking the deck. But I don't believe Bolton necessarily did that. I think Bolton did have an agenda.
And to present them in a way that is meaningful and sort of ordered, such that the president can, understand, the full spectrum of the available choices. So if you could cue up the next thing, because that what you just mentioned about the Kurds is the next quote. We're almost done here. this is kind of the first place where he really comes at Trump hard, saying that Trump wanted to withdraw most U.S. troops from Syria and persuade Arab states to deploy more of their own forces there, as well as pay for the remaining U.S. presence. Sorry, he did not see the substitution of Arab for U.S. forces as a strategic redirection, but as a way of deflecting U.S. domestic political criticism for his increasingly blunt public comments about withdrawing from Syria. So that's a pretty damning comment to make, that he's accusing the president of, as you said, betraying our Kurdish allies. And there is a quote near the beginning where he says something kind of nasty about the Kurds, and I tweeted that on the feed, where he basically calls them all cowards, which I think is uncalled for and inaccurate. But it says that Trump was on this decision. Trump was essentially sandbagged by Mattis on the range of target options. So again, this is the same complaint that he has over and over again about Mattis. Trump seemed troubled, but he offered no real direction. So he's sort of accusing the president of being weak, not able to stand up to Mattis, or not willing to stand up to Mattis. That's the accusation. And to some degree, I can kind of understand the allegation. On the other hand, if he's making the point that it's the president's, that it's the job of the president's advisors to present him with a full spectrum of options, what's he supposed to do? I mean, he's not supposed to be the expert on this. Mattis is, and Bolton is supposed to be an expert. But it seems like a bit of a cheap shot, I would say. It doesn't quite land given the context of what's being laid out in the book. Although I understand what he's saying, that Mattis sandbagged him, but how can you blame the president for that? Which he sort of implicitly does. It's not just Mattis. He also took swings at I mentioned Mnuchin and Haley. So there was, so Haley and Mnuchin were at this meeting. Mnuchin strongly backed Mattis, although he manifestly had no idea what he was talking about. Scorch. If you could cue that up. I have two quotes. The one about Mnuchin is in pink and the one about Haley is in yellow, to keep them separate, because these are two different ideas. But Nikki Haley explained that her husband was in the National Guard, so we should try to avoid military casualties. Oh my gosh. I mean, could you be a little more condescending? Could you be a little more dismissive of Nikki Haley? I'm not sure. I wasn't there. So I don't know exactly how she phrased it. But this seems like a very uncharitable characterization. I have less of a problem with what he said about Mnuchin. I mean, if you don't, he was the Treasury Secretary. If he had no idea what he was talking about, that sounds perfectly reasonable. But to accuse Nikki Haley of making it all about her husband being in the National Guard, I don't know. Something about that just makes me a little uncomfortable. How do you feel about that?
Could you put the quote back up?
Yeah. Let me put it back up. Oops, sorry, wrong one. I had two more. I have one more after this one. So 758. I have them all numbered unusefully. All right, if you could throw that back up. So yeah, the yellow quotation. Nikki Haley explained that her husband was in the National Guard, so we should try to avoid military casualties.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, he's accusing her of, since I guess it's of putting her husband ahead of national security interests. I don't think that there's anything wrong with wanting to avoid military casualties.
Yeah, that's pretty telling that Bolton has a problem with that.
Yeah. But it's just the way that it's phrased. Yeah, it's very personal, very dismissive. There's another episode in the book, and there's so many little vignettes that we can't include everything. But one was where Nikki Haley went on TV and announced that we were going to impose sanctions on the Russians related to this whole Syria issue, and she went on TV and announced it before the Russians knew was going to happen. Before we had said through our, the appropriate channel, conveyed that to them, and normally that announcement is made by somebody else in the administration, but she wanted to be the person who got the headlines, and so that one I can kind of understand a little more as a swipe. This one to me sounds very catty, very very petty, and yeah, just something about it just really sits wrong with me, and I can't quite put my finger on it. But I think you got it. There's nothing wrong with not wanting Americans to suffer casualty. To suffer U.S. to suffer more casualties than are necessary.
How selfish of her that she doesn't want her husband to die. That's terrible.
Yeah, really. Yeah,
terrible.
Yeah. So okay. So final quote. So I wanted to end because he hates Mattis. If there is one villain in this book, it's not Donald Trump. It is General Mattis. So he calls again. He's talking about deck stacking, like a classic bureaucratic ploy by a classic bureaucrat, which I don't think I've ever heard Mattis called a classic bureaucrat before. I don't think I'll ever hear him called that again. He was a general, but okay. Yeah, he takes a kind of a light swipe here at Trump. Trump didn't help by not being clear about what he wanted.
Because he's
randomly from what's that?
I guess I'm reading ahead, so it's like, yeah. So Trump asking questions is a bad thing. It says because now we can't have a coherent discussion. Well, if Trump doesn't understand something, he should ask. That's not a bad thing. I'm sorry. Maybe you don't like questions. That's the old, well, he's asking dumb questions. Well, if he doesn't know the answer, he's not asking dumb questions.
Right. Yeah, and that's why they're there, is to be his advisors and to explain the options. And it seems like Bolton's trying to have his cake and eat it too in a lot of places, especially when we talked about Mattis.
That just really hits me bad. It's like, so you're upset that Trump was asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's terrible. That our head executive would actually ask questions of his staff and try to figure out
history's greatest monster.
I can understand the frustration if Bolton thinks if he understands everything and the president isn't. I get that. I get that personal frustration, but I would rather have a man, or woman. I would rather have a chief executive. If they don't understand something, they should ask. I would rather have that. And even if they appear stupid, at least they're actually figuring out what the hell's going on. Because you can't be an expert on everything,
Sure. And yeah, they have to have a the whole purpose of having an administration, of having advisors, is to get in these sorts of questions. So, so here's I mentioned what was the other quote that was just so strange? Oh, the Iran being the world's central banker of terrorism, which I think maybe kind of squint, maybe I kind of get it, but gosh, the media portrayed the meeting, the details of which were promptly leaked, as Mattis prevailing because of his moderation. In fact, the spirit of Stonewall Jackson lived in Mattis and his acolytes. There stands Jackson like a stone wall, as the Confederates said at the first Battle of Bull Run. What's he talking about? Is he saying that he was stubborn? Because it's sort of a mixed metaphor, because they start by talking about a leak. And if the opposite of leaking is stonewalling,
if you know the history of the name, it's even more muddled, because there's a very famous interpretation that the Stonewall Jackson comment wasn't meant as a compliment. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah,
it was actually meant to show that his inaction at the Battle of Bull Run, that he was just sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
So people don't know to this day, because the person who said it was killed. That's just a little bit of history there. So the Stonewall Jackson term, although it came to be regarded as a good thing, obviously, by Jackson, that's what it was known as. We don't know the person who gave it to him, whether he meant it as a compliment or not. Right. He may have actually meant it as an insult.
Yeah. So,
and clearly, of course, in this case, Bolton means it as an insult. So he's
apparently so.
Yes.
Yeah. But what the insult is, it's really hard to decipher. So I don't think this is bad prose. I don't think this is badly written. I mean, we've read a lot of these quotations. It's written fairly clearly. Some of the analogies don't make a lot of sense, and it's kind of a breezy diary style of writing. So far that's what the book is. Trump actually doesn't feature too often in this. A lot of it's about the infighting, a lot about Mattis, a lot about Bolton himself.
Well, how many pages do you have to go, Pete?
Well, let's see. I'm 75 pages into the book, and it's about 500 pages long. So I have 425.
You're not even at the tip of the iceberg, Pete. There's plenty more space for him to insult everybody. So
you'll
have to keep us surprised on how the book proceeds, for sure.
Where he tries to poison Nikki Haley's coffee. Oh, goodness. That didn't happen. That's not actually in the book, just to be clear. All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys for tuning in, as always. My name is Pete Maines. I'm here with my co-host, Eric Alexander. And until next week, you keep flying free.